Hello and welcome to Share.care's What is Manly radio show and podcast. Men feel more lonely, lost, and not useful in society than ever in history. Males are not attaching to school, work, or women. What it means to be a man appears lost. Is there a framework for being manly that we can unearth?
Welcome to Share.care, an all-inclusive community sharing experience, strength, and hope to create strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships. Share.care communities work toward every individual feeling safe, valued, and heard, free from the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Each episode, founder Damian Andrews explores the principles underpinning Share.care and invites expert special guests to share their knowledge so you can easily reap the benefits so many others experience. You hold the choice to create your future. Let it be with strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships.
Hello, Frank. How are you?
I'm doing great. Glad to be with you.
Likewise. Isn't Zoom fantastic? I mean, well, I think it came from COVID where people actually realized we can have these communications. It's nice to be able to connect with people all around the world.
It's fantastic. Yes, I really enjoy it.
So awesome. So for the audience, I have with me Frank Forencich. I've got that right, I think. And Frank he's got a BA from Stanford University in Human Biology. He's a member of the Council of Directors of the True Health Initiative. He's got a black belt in karate and aikido, something that I'm really impressed by. He's traveled to Africa on several occasions to study the human origins, and he's the author of a number of books relating to health and the human predicament, including Beware False Tigers, The Sapiens Curriculum, and his latest book, if I've got this correct, is The Enemy is Never Wrong. Is that correct? Fantastic.
That is correct, yeah.
Thank you, Frank, and it's a pleasure to have you here and to discuss this topic of what is manly, because it appears, if you listen to the popular press, that there's a lot of men out there now today that are lost, they're feeling lonely, they don't feel useful in society. What's your experience with that? What have you seen in the world?
Right. Well, it's not just men. I would start from that perspective, because there is trauma and alienation across pretty much the entire human population.
Mm-hmm.
And as a biologist, I look at this as from a mismatch orientation. So the idea here is that the human body is evolved to live in wild, outdoor, natural environments. And now in a very short period of time, we've constructed this modern world that has just an incredible number of challenges to body and mind, spirit. And we're living, in effect, in an alien environment. And you might even say that that is traumatizing to everyone, but men in particular. There's a lot of challenges that we face that are imposed upon us by this alien environment.
So what's the difference there? What is that challenge to adjust? Is it, and I love this take. I haven't heard this before, so this is fantastic. So you're saying we're living in an alien environment. What are the different challenges when we look at, as you said, we evolved to live in an outdoor environment? You're obviously expert in biology. How is that where we're living now different from before? I mean, I certainly like waking up under my doona when the bed is warm than out in a tree that's cold. What is the challenge?
Right. Well, the obvious challenge right out of the gate is the lack of physicality in the modern world, because this is something that we enjoyed throughout our history. And we had this robust physical experience that challenged the body every day. And so we were, it's no exaggeration to say that we have been wild animals for most of our time on this planet. And now we have this domesticating influence of sedentary living. And I think that hits men particularly hard because we have this desire to engage physically with the world. We want to know what we're made of. We want to know what we're capable of. We want to put our bodies up against the world and see. And this is a process of self discovery that every man, especially young men, crave. And we can sometimes satisfy that through sports. We can sometimes satisfy that through outdoor adventure sports. But if that doesn't work for you, then you could be in real trouble because then you have to live a sedentary lifestyle that is deprived of physicality. And right off the bat, that's a tremendous challenge to the male animal.
Is that part of the makeup? Because I love that take because there is a lot about not being active anymore in the world, and it makes sense what you're saying that it relates to moving from this physical environment where you're outside and you literally have to be physical to survive. Because if you don't get out there and do something, well, you're not going to catch any food, you're not going to eat, or you're not going to pick. You physically got to do that now. Uber Eats and it delivers to you. I shouldn't be name dropping, but any of those call up and deliver things, and you don't have to get out. Is that so? This need to be physical, particularly in men, is that linked to testosterone in our bodies as well?
Oh, I'm sure it is. I'm not an expert on the endocrinology of this,
Yeah.
but I think it's just part of our primate heritage, our
Mm.
mammalian heritage. I mean, if you the comparison I always make is you take your dog and you put your dog in the garage and you leave your dog in the garage for a very long time and maybe feed him occasionally, but deprive that animal of movement, deprive that animal of natural, normal sensation and social bonding that they would normally have. After a few months, that dog is going to develop all sorts of afflictions. And the obvious question, well, is there something wrong with the dog? And the short answer is no. The problem is not with the dog. The problem is with the environment that the dog is living in. So we need to keep our focus on context and predicament, situation, the circle that surrounds the modern human animal.
And so that leads to because I want to talk to about role modeling as well, but I really want to understand this component of um, yeah, as you're saying, you derive the dog of physical experience, or derive the animal, and we're animals as well. Derive us of that experience of physical activity and the social connection, and as you say, you start to develop ailments. How do I mean? How do we recognize that? Is it a case of is it something innate that we can just recognize and say, okay, I actually need to go out and get a little bit active and do that, or is it what do we need to do to? I mean, I look at it from my perspective, and this morning, it's morning for me, night for you, but for morning, I got up, I immediately, jumped out of bed, um, went to do ablutions first if we're going to be really technical, and then I did some push-ups, did some core strength exercises, some stretching. Took me about 10 minutes, and then got a few things ready, had some breakfast. But is it? I mean, to me, it doesn't seem that hard. Where have we lost this? Where have we lost it? Where people are not doing this kind of thing?
Right. Well, what you describe is something I think of as a movement snack. So I
Mhm.
get away from these words exercise and workout. Those words don't work as well for me. So I prefer the word movement. And so what you've done here is created a movement snack. And my guess is you do that several times throughout the course of the day. And
Yeah, yeah.
that's more of an ancestral pattern. The thing a lot of people forget is that modern sports, while they can obviously be beneficial for people, they
Mm.
are movement specialties and they don't really connect with our ancestral heritage very much. I mean, if you play baseball, it might be good for you in some sense, but it's arbitrary. It's not an ancestral form of movement. So I think we get sidetracked with sports, and we have to remember our ancestry with this stuff.
Is that why running is so popular? Because we're either running away from something or running to catch something in our history?
Well, right. Running is a particularly interesting case because I've been out with the Bushmen in East Africa,
Yeah,
and I noticed now this is just one tribe in one place, and it's
yeah,
you got to be careful about generalizing too much.
yeah.
But they did not run marathons; they
Mm,
ran short distances, and it was always in a situation that was appropriate to habitat, the time of day, the conditions, the animals, whatever it was. So their movement was always connected to the state of their habitat. And
mm.
that's a powerful thing. But what we've done in the modern world is we abstract things out. We run marathons or we run sprints, and these are all just made up games that may not have anything to do with our history.
I love the term that you use there, movement snack. Is that because from my perspective, I've always understood that if you do little bit often, a little bit of something often is better than doing it a lot once a week. Is, describe for can you explain the movement snack? Because it sounds like you've got a bit of research in that from if I'm reading into you've got a term for it, so I'm guessing you've put some thought into it. So do you want to talk
Right.
about the movement snack and how people can do that?
Right. Well, first of all, if you want to be an Olympic athlete, if you want to be performing at a very high level, you obviously have to do intensive training,
Mm,
which normally we think of as a workout. You have to do that kind of thing. But for general health promotion, to space out your movement throughout the day, there's plenty of research that shows that that's beneficial. And even if you get up for 2 minutes from your computer, you're in your office, you get up and you jump around for a little bit, there's no question that that has good health benefits. And it's not just heart lung stuff, it's cognitive benefits as well, enhances memory. There's plenty of demonstrated benefits there. So it's good for you, and it's fun to do. I keep a medicine ball in my office. So if I'm listening to a webinar or something where I can step away for a moment, I'll start swinging my medicine ball around. And it's not going to make me into a champion, but it will keep me, it keeps my core going, my hips going, my legs going, and it feels great.
do you think, I mean, from that perspective, I mean, because what you're talking about there, you've got a medicine ball that you do that. I said, from my perspective, I'll jump down, do some push-ups and things like that, or I'll even, talk about my mind space. Maybe we'll get into that a bit later, where I do what I call gumping. I've got out here. I'm down at the beach house where I record these things, and I've got this massive lawn. And I got rid of the gardener, and I've got a self-propelled lawnmower, which so you still got to walk behind. And I'll just go
Right.
out there, no headphones, no nothing, and it's a beautiful garden out the back, and I've got a reserve behind me, so I don't have a backyard behind me, and I'll just go up and down, and that's a physical exercise as well. What sort of things that people can do for these movement snacks?
Right. Well, I coming from the martial arts and a little bit of the dance world, the athletic training world, I have put together a series of shapes. And this is all you need because there are three planes of movement. So you've got sagittal plane, which is front and back. You've got frontal plane, which is left, right. And then you've got transverse plane, which is more circular, more horizontal movements.
Hmm.
And if you take circles and spirals and other shapes and combine those with those three planes of movement, you can come up with literally hundreds of variations. And that's really all you need. So you've got your medicine ball, or even pretend to have a medicine ball, and moving in those three dimensions, you can do a lot, especially when you mix it up with different stances.
Mm.
And that's all you need. So you don't need to be really sophisticated. You don't need to know a lot about biomechanics or that kind of thing. It's the human animal is perfectly capable of moving, and this is something when you look at the history of human movement. We were hunters and gatherers for a long time, and scavengers for a long time,
Mm.
and very first optional form of human movement was dance.
Mm.
So I mean, this was a big insight for me. I said, well, dance is not just a fun, interesting creation of the modern world. This goes back many thousands of years, and it was the first thing we did when we got a surplus and we were sitting around the fire with maybe a good meal in us,
Mm.
and let's dance, let's drum, let's sing. These are the basics.
I love that you brought that up, the dance component of things, because I mean, for most women, a guy that can dance is someone that they find attractive, from what I understand.
Right.
And another little story on that was I was at a Christmas party at one of my clients. I was a few years ago now. It was before COVID, and there was a guy on the table with us, and we're talking with a couple, and he'd never danced. And so we're talking about that and saying, well, girls really like that. They're really appreciative. And I was leading on to other things, and this conversation went for a little while, and then I'm on that dance floor, and then I look around, and there he is with his wife, on the dance floor. And so gone over near him, and I said, he said to his wife, "Is he going to get rewarded when he gets home?" And she goes, "Oh yeah, oh yeah." And
Yes.
so go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, it always fascinates me the number of people who say, I can't dance,
Mhm.
or drumming is another thing that I enjoy. And a lot of people say, I have no rhythm,
Yeah.
which I'm always just amazed when people talk this way, because of course you can dance. Of course you have rhythm. There's no rules here. You can just figure it out on your own. The body is fully capable of this.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating you say that. You can't dance, don't have rhythm. I'm just making a note of that. But from that perspective, when we're talking about this, what have I got here? What I was going to go to, this optional movement was dance. Um, do you think from that perspective, because you're saying that was one of the first things you did, and like you don't need rhythm, just get out there. I mean, I think we've all seen the movie Four Weddings and a Funeral, and the crazy guy, going nuts, and and he's just having a good time. And for those who haven't seen the movie, go and watch it and see that it's okay to be really absurd out there on the dance floor. It's fine. But what I'm wondering is, and you talked about the difference here, and you said modern sports is specialized movement. Do you think from that perspective we've got a little bit lost in this thing where you've got to be this expert to exercise? And from that perspective, most people, I know I certainly don't. I'm not looking to be, I mean, when I was younger maybe I did, but certainly now I'm 50 years old, I don't look at it and go, oh, I want to be a professional athlete. That's not my goal. I have no interest in that,
Right.
so I'm not going to work out to that level, nor do I even have an aspiration to do that. Do you think we've lost a little bit where people are thinking that they've got to be this expert? The analogy, you wrote a book about tigers, and I have the analogy of, there's two people walking through the jungle, and a tiger jumps out. One person starts putting on their running shoes, and the other person says, you can't outrun a tiger. And he goes, I don't have to, I just got to outrun it you.
Right.
But that's probably not quite the right metaphor for this analogy, but it's a funny story. But do
Right.
we
Well,
need
no, I agree completely. We've become so overly sophisticated and overly reliant on experts and expertise and falling in love with technology. All of this stuff makes us leapfrog over the fundamentals. And the fact is that the young human animal, I'm thinking of physical education now, the young human animal is perfectly capable of moving beautifully, just like our dogs and
Mm.
cats do. They come pre-wired, they're ready to move, and they don't need a lot of sophistication. And this is, I think, the tragedy of modern physical education, because I've been involved with some of this, and I see a tendency to really try and leapfrog over the fundamentals to get to exercise science and technology and sophistication. And I think that's a real distraction.
Do you think that's more because similar sort of thing? I mean, you've got studied a fair bit of martial arts, and I got my son to do martial arts from an early age, mainly from a stillness perspective, because he was a little bit hyperactive, maybe, and
Mhm.
and rather than dose him up with drugs, I just sent him off to martial arts. But I mean, it was a program run by the school, and also the sensei who's he's a seventh dan black belt in karate, and he's now a good friend of mine. But he had a very And it seems to be every martial art that I've studied always has this fundamentals first. Get to the fundamentals. You've got to work through the fundamentals. Is that
Mhm.
your experience as well? And do we need more of that for young men?
Oh, yes. The story I've always heard about the martial arts from parents is that they have the young child who is hyperactive and distracted and unfocused, and then goes into a karate program and does fundamental basic movements. Bow to the mat, bow to your sensei, bow to the training partner, and only move when you are instructed to move. So sensei
Mm.
says, put your right leg back, now punch. Put your left leg back, now punch. And that tracks what we know about the nervous system and embodied cognition. If you discipline the body to do one thing at a time, one simple movement at a time, that in effect imposes some order on the brain. And it's fantastic. So many parents report that their kids do a lot better in focused activity after that kind of training.
Yeah, that's what.
It's just incredibly valuable.
Because I love what you're talking about here about we've got overly sophisticated and leapfrogging the fundamentals. And part of my experience includes construction and working in large infrastructure projects. And I know, the high-rise buildings that I've built, if it doesn't have a good foundation, it's not going to stand up. Or if the bridges we built didn't have a good foundation, it's not going to stand up. Is that what we need more of for let's put some of this sophistication aside, overly complicating it, go back to some of the simple stuff and go, "Hey, this is what you need to do. Just do this simple stuff and it'll be okay."
Right. Yeah, I enjoy sophisticated knowledge. It's fun to go down the rabbit hole on some ideas about the body and that kind of thing.
Mm,
But really, what's really important is the core physical experience, the primal experience of walking, of running, of jumping, of turning the body in three planes, and especially in play with other people. That's where things get really rich, because you can have this social engagement with other human bodies that have their own shapes, their own movement arcs, and that's fantastic training that you could never get from a machine. I mean, people are 1,000 times more interesting than an exercise machine would ever be. So that's why I don't particularly go to the gym very often, because I'd rather play with another person.
mm. With that playing with the other person, if we take that to, sports and for kids, and there's a lot out there about now, taking away the scores and getting participation trophies for turning up. Um, and it's good that you turned up. Yeah, should get a pat on the back. I agree with that. But
Mhm.
is it? Have we lost a little bit in that? This for men anyway. This ability to be competitive, is that important for guys? Do we need that competitiveness?
Yeah, I think that primates are naturally rank oriented and competitive. And it's easy to imagine our ancestors doing, say, foot races out on the savannah when conditions were good,
Mm.
but can't imagine them turning that competition into a full-time gig. I mean, there were other things to do on the grassland, and making a living was paramount. So probably a little bit of competition is built into the human organism, but we've gone way beyond that. And we've taken things that are normally cooperative, normally nourishing, and turn them into sports that become something else entirely. This is my experience in the world of rock climbing. When I started in California, rock climbing was something you do with your friends, and you go out and you have adventures with your
Mm.
friends. And it was all very um, cooperative, and it was exciting. There were stories and legends even that came out of that world. But then over the next 30 years, it became a sport, and the
Mm.
values changed and the emphasis changed, and people got really good. I mean, the climbers you see today are fantastic. but something was lost along the way too.
Because I wonder about that from the perspective of innovation. I mean, competition inspires innovation, but as you say, it's got to be done in a way that is what was the word you used? I've forgotten. But it's also creates that harmony. I love what you talked about, where they went out and they had this running race, and then they got on and did the rest of their life. So it was in the sporting field, that was it, and then they were able to close the door on it and move forward. Do we need to come back to something more along those lines? Do we need that? Do we need that competition to have that innovation so we can keep moving forward? But do we need to have a framework around how that works?
Right. Well, there's some coaches I think who get it right. One fellow in particular I think of here is John Wooden, who was a famous basketball coach at the
Mm,
NCAA level, and he produced like many championships and many NBA stars.
mm,
But his emphasis was a little bit different. He said, okay, we're competing and it's nice to win games. But for him, the emphasis was always on the full development of the person, the full
mm,
development of the athlete as a well-rounded human being. For John Wooden, it was all about how people show up for practice every day. That was the emphasis. And he was so passionate about that disciplined training in practice and the development of the whole human being, that the competition took care of itself. I mean,
mm.
by the time their teams got to the championships, they were going to win because they were so well trained and they became well-rounded human beings. So that's a good model.
Because that sounds like we're coming back to those fundamentals again. Because if you even
Right.
look at martial arts, it's the same sort of thing. Get the fundamentals right, the rest will take care of itself.
Right. And you could talk about John Wooden as being a sensei
Mm.
because it's a very similar idea. We're here to develop the whole human being. And if you want to compete a little bit in that, that's fine. But let's keep our eye on the objective here, which is a well-rounded person.
And yeah, so that's what I want to get to, that whole point of developing a well-rounded person. And I love that you brought up that sport, because I also remember reading about Michael Jordan, and I understand he was cut from his high school team because the
All
coach
right.
said, "Look, you're highly talented, yes, but you're not committed enough. You're not putting your heart into this, and so you're not
Mhm.
making the team." And from that actually motivated him to try harder. And I, similar sort of thing when my son was starting martial arts, he wasn't putting in much effort. And I knew there was a grading coming up, and I knew, having talked to his sensei, that the other kids were going to pass, and my son wasn't. And I
Ooh.
decided I'm not saying anything, and I let him go. And he went there. Everyone else got their belt. He didn't. And as we're walking out, I asked him how it felt, and he wasn't happy. I said, "What are you going
Right.
to do about it?" So and that's where you're talking about developing the whole person. Is that where we need to get that focus back and go, hey, this is about, yes, competition. We need to have that competition, but the purpose of the competition is to develop yourself as a person.
Right. Right. And there's so many other attributes that we could include in the whole human being.
Mm,
And this is especially sensitivity to other people, learning
mm.
learning who you are in the world, what your identity is, overcoming trauma. All of these things are essential to that well-rounded person.
Is it also too when we put in that category as well? I remember Einstein famously quoted, if you judge a goldfish by its ability to climb a tree, it's always going to fail. Do we need to have that perspective, where not just at, well, not of the people around us, but of ourselves? Do we need to be teaching that from a young age, going, hey, I mean, I look at my son, he's 6 foot, he's 14 and 6 foot. He's never going to be a jockey. It's
Right.
and that's a realistic perspective to have and go, well, okay, what are your talents, and focus on that. Is that what we need to be encouraging people to, or certainly men to go, hey, there is part of this foundation is being true to who you are, There, and
Right.
get out there. There's somebody. Well, there was 7.7 billion people on the planet, so and roughly half of those are women. The chances of you not finding someone are pretty slim if you are true to who you are. Do we need to come back to that and say, have that focus of going, who are you? You decide on that, and then go out into the world.
That's an essential point, and I'm glad you brought it up because one one theme for men is this idea of the warrior ethic. And
Mm,
a lot of us are raised with this warrior ethic, and it gets pounded into us that we are here to serve the tribe and to work for the welfare of the tribe, and even if necessary, to die for the tribe. That's the warrior ethic as we understand it. And that idea of self-sacrifice is honorable, and it goes a long way for people. I think it's useful, but the shadow side of that is that if you go all in on the warrior ethic and you say my only purpose in life is to serve the tribe, you could forget who you are. You may
mm,
completely miss the point of your own authentic self, and that's a big price to be paid. So, maybe I grow up as a warrior athlete to serve my school, my university, my city, whatever it is. And then by the time I hit middle age, I get my first injuries and now I can't play anymore.
mm,
And then you are hit with this realization is like, wow, I spent the last 20 years of my life devoted to this warrior ethic. I don't even know who I am now.
mm.
So that's that's a problem. That's a
It,
problem for a lot of men.
Well, it's an interesting you bring that up because I mean, on top of a number of things, I'm a Star Trek fan, so the Klingons have the warrior ethic. But it was
Yeah.
interesting in my time because I was in the Australian Army and posted to the Special Air Service Regiment, and we were taught there, or the Australian Army as a whole was taught, because you have that warrior ethic, die for your country, that kind of thing. We from day one we were taught you're not here to die for your country. You're here to make the other people die for theirs. And it was an interesting thing. It was and when you look at it and studying some of World War II history, it was interesting how look the Japanese was a great example there, where they had the kamikaze pilots go out. What it resulted in was a lot of their good talent dying.
Mhm, mhm.
And there was I can't remember the name of the battle, but there was a battle where the Americans had sent out their fighters, and they only had just enough fuel to get back, and it was getting late, and it was night as they were coming back in, and the admiral of the group, the carrier group, said, "Light it up, turn on all the lights of the battle fleet," which exposed them massively. But he said, "We need to get these people home."
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so that seems to be a very different ethos than the core of the warrior ethic, that it's noble to die for your cause. It seems to be you want to save that talent and nourish that talent to go forward. Is that a different evolution that we're going through?
Right. Well, the Japanese culture was so extreme on the warrior ethic that there was really no room left for anything else. I mean, you serve your tribe, that
Mm,
is your purpose in life.
yeah.
And there was really no time or reason to ponder what your own personal path might be.
Mm,
So that was a real extreme example of the warrior ethic. And it doesn't really nourish us.
mm,
It goes too far. So we need to be well-rounded. We need to know who we are as authentic people, and that's why the warrior ethic can be a little bit of a problem. I think it's similar to what women face, especially young girls who are raised to be people pleasers. And
yes.
this is something that happens a lot. And if you're a young woman, a young girl who's raised to be a people pleaser, you may arrive in adulthood and have no idea who you are.
Mm.
And so it's a problem, you might say, amnesia for all of us now. And we need to discover who we are.
Well, that's what I'm wondering from that perspective. Is it something that was always there from history that that warrior ethic would? Because I can imagine that it would be to a certain extent when you look at how we needed to survive. The group had more chance of surviving if it stayed as a group. Uh, Whereas, and you see that all through animals as well. The groups, if the group that stays together, it's more has a higher chance of survival than if a lone animal goes out there. So you wanted to be part of the group. And to be part of the group, you had to serve the group. If you didn't do that, then you kind of got ostracized. So it's kind of a round thing. But do you think we've got to a state of our evolution? Because you mentioned before we've moved from being out in the wild to now in an urbanized environment where you don't need to be part of a group to survive. You can survive quite well without being part of it. I mean, whether in the same way you needed to be before. Obviously, you want to have that social connection, but we'll put that aside for the moment. Do you think that's part of this thing now? We've actually moved to a different level of evolution where we don't need to be part of a group to survive, but we're still kind of holding on to that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think when we look at the paleo, we look at
Mm,
human history and look at our predicament on the grassland, we were surrounded by, in effect, lions and tigers and bears. I
yeah.
mean, we have predators around us all the time.
Mm,
And if you're in a tribe of, say, 50 to 100 individuals, and there are lions, hyenas, large animals around you, you have a shared predicament. You have a sense of shared predicament, and everybody agrees on what is dangerous.
mm,
So that gives you a sense of unity. And from the point of view of the autonomic nervous system, everybody's having a pretty similar experience about fight, flight, or rest and digest, that whole
mm,
thing. And there is that unity. In that situation, it's easy to come to consensus because if you agree on what's dangerous, then it's easy to make decisions. But
mm,
now in the modern world, we don't have that sense of shared predicament anymore. Everything's
mm,
scattered, and people are having wildly divergent experiences throughout the day.
mm.
So without the shared predicament, you we can go through life and it's very difficult to come to consensus now, and that is stressful. That's unbelievably stressful if the people in your neighborhood don't even agree on what's dangerous.
Yeah, well, is it okay? Because I mean, that consensus it's an important point that you've raised there. Is it a case too now because we have, if you go back to, what you were talking about there, where we've got lions and tigers that can, eat you, and we've also got, there was some sense of civilization, but really there wasn't, a strong rule of law, so to speak, like we have today in the civilized worlds. You have, I don't, worry about someone breaking into my house. A lot of times, so, as many times the door hasn't been locked, and my car often doesn't have the door locked. And it's one of those things where you go, well, because of the rule of law, people behave differently, so we're not exposed to danger as much. And is that a cause and effect on our ability to, like you say, come to that consensus, but also to choose? We don't have this pressure, so we've got a lot more freedom. Is what I'm getting to with this. And I'll take that to the example of when I look at my dad, for example. He worked in the same organization all his life, and he never had thought of, well, maybe he did, but I'm not aware of it, that he had thought of changing to a different organization. It just wasn't on the radar. So
Mhm.
where he worked was pretty set. From my perspective, I've lost count. I can remember my tax file number off by heart because I've had that many jobs and I've filled out that many applications. So from that perspective, people today have so much more choice.
Yes,
Have we
yeah.
lost the ability, or have we not taught the ability how to make a decision?
It becomes more and more difficult because there is more and more innovation.
Mm,
Um, there's a psychologist out there, I can't remember his name right off, but he wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice.
mm,
And he talks about the conditions in the modern world where people in marketing and business and commerce assume that consumers want more choice.
Mm.
So they're constantly giving us more options. I mean, you got 500 varieties of shampoo or ketchup or whatever it is now, and everything becomes a homework project. And that's this avalanche of choice now that we have,
Mm.
incredibly stressful.
Mm.
The, from a historical view, the thing you have to remember is that for most of human history, there was no innovation. I mean,
Yeah.
we would go for many, many hundreds of generations with really no change in human lifestyle at all. There
No.
are stone tool designs that extend in the fossil record for many thousands of years.
Mm.
And if you were a parent, you could assume that your child would grow up in almost exactly the same conditions that you grew up in.
Mm.
And then with the scientific revolution, then you get this avalanche, this just tsunami of innovation and change. And for every advantage that that gave us, it also gave us new stressors and new choices and new forms of threat and violence too. So
Mm. So that,
it's our situation is totally unprecedented.
yeah, that's what I'm trying to wonder from that perspective. Like you said, you have the same tool for generations. So it's kind of, I'm just wondering whether it was actually started to be ingrained in DNA that people innately, like when a giraffe is born, it automatically knows how to walk. It
Mhm.
wasn't taught that. We come out, we don't know how to walk. Um, maybe someone does, but I know I walked early apparently, but a lot of, I didn't walk when I was born, but there's something in the DNA that does that, and that's why I was wondering from that perspective, do guys need more? And I know it applies to both sexes, but this is about what is manly. Um, do we need more education around this is how you make a decision for you? This is how you cut off. I mean, decision, I think it comes from the Latin, which means to cut off, if I remember correctly. I'd have to
Mhm.
look that up again. Einstein said, don't remember anything you can look up because it clogs up your thinking." So that's my excuse for not remembering things. But is it a case of we need to be spending more time teaching guys, hey, this is how you make a choice. You decide on doing this, and some people may not agree with you, but that doesn't matter.
Right, absolutely. I think we need guidance because our situation is so unprecedented. And
Mm.
this is where teachers and coaches can come in and help us with that process. And I take a little bit of inspiration from the world of what's now called minimalism. And this is a philosophy, an idea
Mm.
of having fewer possessions and getting by with less, simplifying our lives. And that I find very useful. It's like you
Mm.
don't need a big pile of stuff. You need a few high quality items in your life. And here's how to make those choices. So our teachers and
Mm.
coaches can help. Yeah.
So from that perspective, I love that you brought that. We don't need that big pile of stuff. I was certainly probably at the top of the list of accumulating big piles of stuff. I still collect a lot of Lego. I like my Lego. But it's one of those things, as I mentioned before, I go out and I do my gumping because I enjoy that. I got rid of the gardener so I could do that.
Mhm.
Um, is it a case of we need to go, well, what is really important for us and coming back, and this is where we're making that choice of deciding what's right for us as a person, and being okay with that regardless of what anyone else says.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, if you have some sense of your own identity, then it's easier to make those choices. You can say, look,
Mm.
I need this, I don't need that. And I think that this is something that just comes with maturity and adulthood. You go out and you make mistakes, you traumatize yourself with bad mistakes, and then you get a real good sense of what works, what doesn't. And little by little, you stumble through life and you learn who you are. And then you can start making those decisions. But yeah, some coaching would be helpful.
Well, I mean, from that perspective, you said you have a sense of who you are, and the coaching side of things. And that's why I want to come back to. We were talking earlier about, and I mentioned about role modeling. Is it a case, because, and it was someone brought this up, was that before the Industrial Revolution, people, men, when they were growing up, boys would do that. Their, their dad might be a carpenter or something like that, and then the sons would go along with the dad and
Mhm.
do the carpentry. And like you were talking about that axe that goes through generations, this was part of that skill. So they would role model. But now we seem to have lost that, because we can go and do a whole bunch of different things. And certainly parents want their children, or some parents want their children to go out and do other things. Where, I know of people that I grew up with, whereas the parents were laborers and they wanted their children to get an education, so that they didn't have to do that. Have we lost a bit of that role modeling in society for men?
Right, because a lot of our professions have become, you might say, obsolete,
Mm,
and a lot of the arts and crafts, the handwork that we did with simple tools, that has been eclipsed by so much of the digital stuff,
mm,
and that's a big loss. I mean, I
mm,
remember growing up learning how to use a hammer, learning how to saw wood and doing basic operations. That gives the body an incredible amount of pleasure and satisfaction. But
mm,
then move all that over to the digital realm, and you can do amazing things on a computer, but it physically is not satisfying at all.
mm.
So there's been a big loss there. And this is why I think a lot of men do well by going back to fundamental use of basic tools.
Is that
It's
okay? I mean, because in education, certainly in higher education, um, I think it's about only 40% of men get higher education, which is significantly lower than what women get. And I was reading a report now. If you're looking at equality of numbers in the workforce, there's a real struggle at that higher end to actually get men now. The compass
right.
is flipped completely. Whereas, because there's so many more educated women out there than there are men, men are not getting educated. But is it fundamentally because of that different learning style that men need to be more physical, that the way we're teaching at a young age, from a young age, is not in a style that is actually conducive to majority of men or boys learning?
Oh, I think that's right on the mark. Yeah, we need to find a way to educate men that is more physical,
Mm,
and we're we're largely failing to do that because our schools are modeled on universities, and at the university, the top of the pyramid is cognitive performance,
mm,
and the body is kind of demoted. I mean, we you go back to Rene Descartes and this separation of mind and body, and the modern academic world has totally bought into the Cartesian point of view. So
mm,
this is what you see at an academic conference. You go to an academic conference and you see people behind the podium. They're not moving their body at all. They
mm.
are delivering cognitive content, and sometimes it's powerful, sometimes it's important, but the body is not invited to the party. And that's a major loss.
That's an interesting point that you raised. I've just had a kind of an epiphany that I wasn't aware of before, because well, epiphany is probably not the right word, but I'm just thinking about my son's school. He goes to a high end private school here in Australia, and it's a boys only school. But as you were talking about that in respect of movement, I noticed in the magazines that come out, the monthly magazine, there's a large part of that that's devoted to performing arts. A large part of it's devoted to sports. Yes, there's academics as well, and they perform extremely well academically. But it's interesting the balance that is there, that actually getting out and doing things. And I was just wondering from that side of things, well, also from that was this. I mean, when you look at the schools, my stepdaughters went to an all girls school that they catered, and it was a high end school as well. They catered the education to suit the girls. They actually didn't have the tables set up in lines as you normally get in school. They had small classrooms, obviously, had the money to do that, but the tables were in a round circle because girls like to communicate, and that's how they explained it. They said that's how girls learn, by this communication, talking. So we have the tables in a round fashion to do that. boys are different, and I'm not sure. I mean, I know that the classrooms are set up, in a different. They're not in that round format that the girls had. But do we need to have that separation of boys and girls to learn from that perspective? Obviously, we need to connect with each other as well, so it's a double-edged sword, maybe. But do we need to
Yeah,
have that framework of learning for boys as well?
maybe. And I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I
Mm,
do know from my martial art background that my sensei was very even handed with boys and girls, men and women.
mm,
And he didn't really care.
yeah.
As far as you show up, you put on your gi, your uniform, you put on your belt, you bow to the mat, you are
Mm,
you are training. And I don't care whether you're a man or a woman or a boy or a girl. And and it worked in that arena.
yeah.
So I think there's plenty of overlap
Mm.
in the need for physicality. A lot of women and girls need that too. They can flourish with that as well.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, the girls' school that they went to very much had a very strong physical program as well across a number of,
Mhm.
again, performing arts and sports as well. I was just wondering from that perspective, given the different learning styles of boys and the fact that boys are not getting to this higher education, do we need to adjust, how that learning? Because it's not like boys don't have the mental capacity. I hated school when I was there. Not that and I loved learning. I loved learning a lot. I just didn't like the way it was done at school.
Right.
Um, and it was only as a mature age student I went back into to university and studied there. But even then, I still hated it. And it
Yeah.
became just that learning process. But I just wondering about, do we need to adjust that education?
I
Um,
think so. Yeah. Yeah.
hmm. How does from that perspective, and we touched on this before, this self-actualization, being true to yourself. How does someone go about? How do we? Because I look at it, this role modeling side of things. Again, I really counting how fortunate I was growing up. My family certainly wasn't perfect from in a lot of areas, but I look at my relationship with my dad, which also wasn't perfect in many times in my life. But I do recall, my dad would play social golf and lawn bowls, and as a young kid, I went with him to play with him. So we played, but then we actually got to the point where we'd arrive, and then I'd be sent off with, if it was golf, there was three other, and I'd be, as the four, I'd go off with these other guys, and I'd go around 18 holes of a golf course with these other guys who are much older. I'm
Mhm.
obviously learning because I'm newer to golf than they were. So I'm asking questions. So I was in this environment where I learnt to ask questions, and I had, I think they were good role models. I don't remember any misogynistic behaviour or anything like that.
Right.
So I can, but have we lost that from this perspective of, when I've talked to a number, and I certainly know in Australia, you can have women's gyms, but you can't have men's gyms because it'd be deemed sexist. Have we lost the male spaces where we need to have that, where we get to have those environments?
Right. And if you go back to paleo,
Mm,
that would have been a huge part of the young child's experience, especially the young man's experience, where you would wait around camp
mm,
for probably the first 12 years of your life, and eventually you would be invited on the hunt.
mm,
And you would play in camp and you would learn a few skills in camp. But you would be obsessed with hunting because that's the only game in town, right? And so you would see the older kids and the men come back from the hunt, and you would observe everything about them. And then you
mm,
would you would go out on easy hunts. You would be invited on the hunt when you were old enough, and you would learn the skills of tracking. You would learn the skills of sensitivity and observation of the animals, and there would have been intense role modeling in something
mm,
like that. So to answer your question, yes, we've lost a lot of that because dad goes off to work, and if the child does not have some sort of role model, then you got to turn to the TV
mm.
or just make it up as you go, and it's a big loss.
Is that really something that is on the parents to do? I mean, I look at it from my perspective with my son. I've got, I took him to a board meeting recently, and I'm pretty sure he was very bored. But he
Right.
got that experience of being there and seeing what I was doing, and that was the point. And I've got him, from a communication perspective. We're on school holidays at the moment. He's got to do 2 public speeches, so just to me, but he's got to prepare and articulate a thought process. Is it really on the parents to set that and say this is what we need to do, and if so, how do we get parents to do that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, every parent is in a different circumstance, and not
Mm,
every is going to be able to role model as much as they would like.
mm,
And this is why I'm so focused on coaches and martial art teachers as well, because they can fill that role. They can be powerful role models. And the young athlete goes to the sporting arena, whatever it is, they're gonna be laser focused on their coach. And if
yeah,
it's a martial art thing, it's going to be the sensei.
yeah,
And so there are other options besides the parents, but it's it's such a powerful, deep experience for the human animal. And it's more than just imitation. There's actual brain systems called the mirror neuron system, where
mm,
we actually observe the posture and facial expression of people around us, and that resonates deep into the body and actually reshapes how the nervous system works. So, like it or not, we role model the people around us. And if you have good role models, your nervous system is going to be sculpted in a good way.
yeah. That's an interesting point you raise there about the mirror neurons, because and that is the case. We do mirror that what's around us. So just wondering from that perspective, how do we? Um, is it a case? Because I was dealing with this, and there was an article at the start of the year in the local press here, well, the national press, and it was that there's a guy called Andrew Tate, who's kind of known as a bit of a misogynistic person, and it was the article was saying how he'd got hold of 90 something percent of young boys and that heard of him, and not physically hold of them, but he was influencing them, and 50% agreed with him. um and I was curious about that. And it was based on a report done by an organization called the Man Cave, which mentors young boys. So I wanted to find out what was there. So I asked for a copy of the report and eventually got it. It took me a few months, but I got it. And then when I looked at the report, what the report said, yes, there was 50% of boys that, in round numbers, that didn't agree with anything they said. Now, and then there was 50% of boys that did. But when you looked at what they agreed with, the things that they agreed with were that he was confident, he was physically fit, and the only part about women, and that was the whole point about this article, that young boys are turning into misogynistic assholes because of people like Andrew Tate. There was 15% of the boys, and this was a sample size of 1,200 boys, so it was a decent sample size. They said
Mhm.
15% of boys agreed with his view on women, but the view on women that was there, and the statement that was associated, was that Andrew Tate had said that sometimes women are confusing to understand, and 15% of boys agreed with that, and that was the only statement where it was from that perspective. So what I'm getting to with that, do you think with social media and in the way media is played out, that there's some extremist comments that are put out that are probably a minority view, and sometimes not even true, because I don't think that article was an accurate representation of what was in that report. Um, Whereas the majority have a fairly sound view of life, and the media, the social media, is just projecting either bullshit or some minority view that isn't substantiated, and we need to be careful of that. Is that something that we need to be aware of from your experience?
Oh yeah, I find social media to be um, more or less a sewer. I mean, there's because anything goes there, and people are often anonymous, and they can say whatever dark, shadowy stuff that they want to say, and so that gets a platform and goes into circulation, and so it's really harmful for a lot of people. And I personally try and avoid it whenever I can. And I mean, obviously, the tools we have to use, but um, yeah, it just gives a voice to some real fringe ideas that aren't healthy for anybody.
Mm.
So, you know,
I love
kids
that.
need to
Oh, go ahead.
kids need to have an authentic experience of people living in the here and now. I think that that's the priority.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a question that I have with that as well, and this has come up for me through this process as well. When we look at social media and posting hateful comments anonymously, I hadn't thought about it in this context before, but it came up recently. That's really a cowardly act.
Oh,
It's
totally. Yeah, yeah.
it's far from manly. I mean, if it's a guy posting it, and that's what we're talking about. And obviously, I would say it's the same for women as well.
Oh,
But
yeah.
you know, if we're teaching young boys or to even older boys to be manly, isn't courage something? And not talking about, you know, the physical going out, the Arnold Schwarzenegger type thing. I pick on Arnold Schwarzenegger a lot, but it's not necessarily, because I mean, you take Jordan Peterson for example. You know, if you were to put him in a an action hero thing, he'd be kind of the wimpy character.
Uh-huh.
You know, and in the same token, it was interesting. The movie Die Hard, when that script was floated around, I think it went to Clint Eastwood and a whole bunch of other people, and they rejected it because they said this character's a total wimp. But when you and it was so is it because I mean having courage doesn't necessarily mean that you're, you know, can physically punch someone up, but it means you can stand up for yourself. I mean, you look at Jordan Peterson. You know, I said again using that example, he's not a physically strong person, but intellectually he'll own you. Um, is that what we need to be having in this framework of manly? Is courage is standing up for what is right?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that the action adventure movies, that whole genre is pretty impoverished because it it portrays one-dimensional men,
Mm,
and that's not a very useful image for young people to attach to. I mean,
mm,
they're strong, they're aggressive, they're macho, and that's pretty much the end of that story. But
yeah.
my senseis, my teachers are much more likely to say to the young man or to the adult to say, look, we want you to be courageous and we want you to be sensitive and we want you to be intelligent. That's part of that well-rounded circle. And yes, courage is a big part of it.
Uh,
And also being sensitive, also being kind, also being compassionate. That's the package deal that we're trying to teach here.
I think you've just, you know, I think all the women out there listening to this just got really excited and and turned on. 'Cause I think you described that package. It's like courage, intelligence, sensitivity, kind, and compassion. Isn't that what, does that not describe a manly man?
Yeah, yeah, and that's the way my sensei pitched it to me. He says, "Look, the whole point in being strong is so that you can be sensitive, and you can
Oh,
stand on your feet, and you can be integrated in your posture, your stance, your relationship to the world. That's why you want to be strong." And that lesson has stuck with me for a very long time since I first heard that. There's a purpose to being strong.
that was gold, platinum even, you know, whatever your medal is. That, you know, the whole point of being strong is so you can be sensitive. That's
Yeah.
powerful. I love that. Is I mean, because that does that sum up the framework of what we're looking here? Is the point is of being manly is to develop your strength, whatever that is. Can be intellectual, can be, you know, your ability to move rocks, whatever. But whatever your strength is, but you're developing that strength so you can be sensitive.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah, and it helps you, overcome your fear,
Mm,
overcome your reluctance, and it it makes you more well-rounded. So
Over
that's the kind of action adventure hero that we need to see in the movies, and we rarely do. So
Yeah, that kind of coming back to Die Hard, but that kind of summed up why that character was deemed as a wimp because he didn't want to be there, didn't want to do it.
right,
He was dealing
right.
with this like whole scenario and had to overcome. It was actually showing on screen. He actually had to overcome all this fear and obstacle to get there. But um, the fear and overcoming fear and reluctance. How do we teach that? How do we teach boys and men to overcome that? We're quoting Winston Churchill that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But how do we overcome that fear?
Well, it's practice of going outside your comfort zone
Mm,
in a safe environment. And that's the job of the coach and the teacher, the sensei, to create those safe environments where the student can meet their fears and push the envelope, as it were. And it's that's the education that we need. That's the experiential design, you might say, that we
mm.
need.
Does that fall back to the role modeling again, being, whether it's parents, a coach, or whatever, having that role model that creates that safe space so you can actually develop this skill of pushing into the unfamiliar?
Right, right. And if I'm a young man and I grow up and I see my parents doing that, pushing their envelope, stepping a little bit outside of their comfort zone into an area of risk and uncertainty and ambiguity, if I see that, if I witness that, then I'm more likely to do it myself.
Mm. And I guess that's where we're kind of lucky in today's society because we have not only well, you've got actual role models out there, but you've got people like you and me and putting content out there where people can actually tap into that. Is that, you know, the,
Right. And
I
that
think,
and that is a step outside the comfort zone. I mean, as you know, by being a teacher, a public figure, as it were, you don't know how people are going to respond. You step up, you make yourself vulnerable, and there's risk involved with that.
mm,
So it's um, it's a courageous act to do that.
I think that's really interesting because, I mean, from that perspective, what I've been massively surprised with in this journey is the commonalities between men and women in what they want. Which is interesting that we're in this environment where men are so scared to open a door for a woman, and yet women are going. And I'm just wondering, is it an urban myth that there's a woman out there that yelled at some guy for opening a door? Because it's just, I'm wondering if that's got a bit lost. Because it seems to me the women want, yeah, they want, as you talked about, courage, intelligence, sensitive, kind, and compassion. I think guys want that as well. I'd certainly, that's part of my mission statement. Compassion's in there.
Right.
Um, it just
Yeah.
how have we got so lost? It just seems to be fundamentally the basics are there.
Yeah. There's a African social philosophy. It's
Mm,
called Ubuntu, Ubuntu, and it's a very simple idea. It's that we are people through other people, and the idea that we're, in a sense, made of other people. And in traditional African cultures, there's a real high emphasis on equality, egalitarian perspectives, and they're less likely to make distinctions between people, between groups of people. They're more likely to see their common humanity. And that's something that is part of this indigenous native worldview, and it's something that we've lost in large measure.
I love that you're talking about seeing the common humanity, because it's interesting from my perspective. Like you, I've traveled a bit, and I've been to at least I lost stopped counting at 44 countries. But what I found really interesting was that everywhere I went, people wanted to enjoy their life, they wanted good things for their kids, and they wanted to connect with their friends. and there's a bunch of other things they wanted, but they're the three that I focused on. And no matter where you went, a smile was a smile.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so have we lost that from that perspective? Or do we need to go back and go, okay, fundamentally we want the same things? And not only that, I mean, one of my business partners, he's Iranian, and I'm fascinated learning about the Persian culture. It's very different from what I grew up. I'm actually Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. I'm all three. I'm integrated, so I can help. Maybe I can help be the peace talker over there. I don't know. And so I grew up. I mean, both my grandmothers were Polish, 100% Polish, so that made us Catholic. So I grew up with a Catholic upbringing. I
Right.
facetiously say I can't be Catholic anymore because I don't feel guilt. But I'm fascinated learning about my business partner's culture and how him and his family interact and different things that they celebrate. And what's fascinating about that is fundamentally there's a lot of similarity between what we celebrate. It's just done differently.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah, the details are different. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. There's um, there's an anthropologist, and I think his name was Donald Brown. He wrote a book called Human Universals,
Mm,
and he went around the world and he just looked at, that was his whole thing, is commonalities. So he said every human culture that has ever been studied has language, and
mm,
they all have a sense of music and play, and the list is quite long. But the whole point is that he was focused on human universals, and that's something we need to return to, because
mm.
there's so much division. And so I think it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people who are under stress to see division and to see difference. But if we would just calm down a little bit, we can look at the human universals.
I love that. Yeah, you're talking about the knee-jerk reaction to stress. And you mentioned earlier that we've created this stress by overcomplicating things, if I
Yes.
understood correctly. So
Uh,
is it a case of we just need to simplify? Maybe I need to get rid of some of my Lego. Do we need to just stop and pause and have that time? Um,
right. Well, speaking of stress, this is something that we are not taking seriously enough. It's a worldwide epidemic, and even the World Health Organization has designated stress as a worldwide epidemic, and that was like in the 1990s when they did that. It's 1,000 times worse now,
mm,
and generally, when this is pitched and talked about in the popular press, it's always pitched as an individual health problem. So you need to moderate your stress because you're going to get a dread disease later on in life, and that's why you should do it. You should do all these stress relieving practices.
mm,
And that's all fine and good, but it's really much more um, pervasive than that, and much more consequential than that, because it affects not just the physiology of our bodies, but the way we think and the way we relate to the world.
mm.
So our the need for stress relief practices right now is greater than ever, and we all need to be doing something in that domain.
What are some key things people can do in that domain? I mean, is it I do my gumping, okay, and I know I can. There's
Right.
times where I've gone out and mowed the lawn. It didn't need mowing, but it was just I needed the space.
Right. And the standard narrative, the standard template for this stuff, everybody's heard about the value of exercise or movement, and the value of getting more sleep, of
Mm,
course, the value of meditation, and these kind of things are familiar to us.
mm,
But for me, there's other practices, including the idea of reframing our experience. That one is very valuable in the way we manage our stress.
mm.
So
And
a lot of this comes down to the stories we tell each other and the stories that we tell ourselves.
mm. It seems to be because we all. I can imagine there's a lot of people out there that wouldn't want to be gumping. I get that, but that's what works for me. And are we coming back to this whole self-actualization of finding what's right for you and just being confident in that and doing what's right for you? And I'm
Yeah,
sure, from your perspective, you have ways that you deal with stress that probably wouldn't work for other people, but it works for you. So you do that.
right. Yeah, I go to the rock climbing gym, and that's a great stress reliever for me, but I can imagine for other people it would not be that way. But yes, no, you've got to know who you are before you can apply these stress relieving practices. Because if you don't have that base, it's you're just going to be following somebody else's template, and that may not be valuable for you.
Is it a case where we need to do that? Because one of the other things that I do, and this is partly through time management, although that term's a misnomer because time's a constant anyway.
Right.
You manage effort, you don't manage time. Um, I have a whole program on that, which is probably the most valuable program that people just don't use. Anyway,
Right. Right.
life is easy in my mind if you just focus on the fundamentals. But do we need to have this? Sorry, I went on a rant then. But
That's good.
is it a case where we just need to take that simple approach and go, decide what's right for you? Coming back to that whole point, as you mentioned before, we didn't have to decide. It was handed down. Here's the axe. This is how you go out and hunt. You didn't have to think, essentially. I think it was
Mhm.
Einstein, someone like that said people don't think. Is it a case where we've actually evolved to this point where we need to think? We need to go, okay, this is right for me. I don't have to be, certainly in civilized worlds. I mean, it might not apply to other areas like, you look at the Sudan right at the moment today. It's a quite dangerous place. Ukraine right now. Um, but certainly in most civilized countries, um, I don't have to worry about someone coming and attacking me on the street. It's just not going to happen. Well, I should say no. The probability is so low; it's not really going to affect my day-to-day life. Um, do we need to be educating people that okay, now you've got this ability, you're not in this fight or flight mentality world that we've evolved beyond that. You need to actually start to think about what is right for you and make that decision. Have we come? I mean, coming full circle to what we talked about earlier, but is that really where we're at with being manly?
Yeah, there's both objective and subjective threats
Mm,
to the human organism right now, and it's true that a lot of us are fortunate enough to live in very safe places.
mm.
And, but even at that, we still manage to convince ourselves that there are dangers. So we're very good at that, and that's one thing to realize is that the fight flight system is a hair trigger system. So the system is symmetrical but not perfectly balanced. So it's very easy to go into fight flight. You just have to imagine some sort of perceived danger and off you go on that side. But one way I find useful to think about this, the autonomic nervous system, this ancient system in the body, is capped by the brain, the cortex, and it's basically driven by story. And it's always
Mm,
asking this question: is my world friendly or not?
yeah.
And effectively, we're asking that question all day, every day. It's not
Mm,
so many words, but the human organism is walking around always. And even when we're asleep, my guess is that we're still asking that question: is the world friendly? Is my habitat friendly? And if the
mm,
answer is yes, then you go to feed and breed, rest and digest, all that healing stuff that we enjoy. But if the answer is no, you go to fight flight.
mm.
So the art here then is to remember the friendly parts of our experience and to get on that side of the teeter totter.
Yeah, because I mean that links back to our focus of what we focus on, the law of attraction, what we think about expands. But
Mhm.
I want to come back to that point you said we convince ourselves that there are dangers out there, and that's why I want to explore this from the perspective of the where was I going with that? This evolution of thinking where in a modern civilized society, a lot of the threats that we think we try to convince, well, we convince ourselves that are there and not really there. It's just something and I remember this, I'm going to use this analogy. I had a mentor, he was the former managing director and CEO of managing director and chairman of BP. And I used to ask him, for advice via text message. That's how we communicated mostly. We caught up every few months, but mostly it was via text message. And he would always not respond straight away. It'd be like 2 or 3 days later. And I get that was, him getting me to think about the problem before, so I find my own solution. But I had this meeting coming up, and I was concerned about it. And I asked, can you get back to me straight away? I'm really worried about that. And his response was, and he responded immediately, which was unusual, but his response was, Damien, I think you should back yourself that you'll make the right decisions for you. Which is one of the most profound pieces of advice in my life that I consider. And is that, when we look at this and we're convincing ourselves these threats, that we put that into context of where we live in, that really you haven't got these great physical threats. And in most circumstances, the issues that come up in your life, you will be able to deal with if you focus on addressing the problem in a logical fashion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Well, this reminds me, there's some good research out there. They brought people into a laboratory and they were able to convince people to view the challenge before them as either a challenge or a threat. And I don't know the details. I don't know how they engineered this, but Group A was looking at the stressor as a challenge. Group B was looking at it as a threat. And there was profound physical differences between the two. So the people who viewed it as a challenge had, for example, an increased heart rate, but they were actually moving. So the diameter of their blood vessels remained large, and the body was operating more efficiently when they viewed it as a challenge. But as soon as they started to view this thing as a threat, then the physiological changes became detrimental. And so now that the heart rate went up, but so did the blood pressure, and this whole list of other detrimental changes took place. So going back to story, if you can tell yourself that this thing you're facing is a challenge rather than a threat, that makes a big difference. And I know people, I have a friend who's an attorney, and she goes into argue cases in front of the judge, and that's her preparation ahead of time. She says, look, this is a challenge. This is not a threat. And she sells that story to herself. And then she goes in the next day, and she's, of course, anxious and nervous, as anybody would be. But then she performs at a high level.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you raised there. I remember watching, because I've been in court a number of times on with clients and work that I've done. I've actually stood up in court. It's a very, very intimidating place. And yeah, one of the barristers I watched, she was amazing. She was just so calm and composed. And I know beforehand that's not how she was. She didn't know, she was worried, and worried is probably not the right word, but yeah, interesting the story that she might have told herself. I might have to ask her that question as to how she did that. But from that side of things, is it a case too, from this what is manly framework, that we need to be encouraging, like Greg did for me, that hey, you've got this, you've got the ability to deal with it.
Yeah, that simple message is so often lost on people. And sadly, some people grow up and they never hear that at all. They never hear somebody say, hey, you've got this. And just that simple motivator from a coach or a sensei or a teacher can make a huge amount of difference. And if you look at the human organism, how amazingly sophisticated it is, that's a true statement. I mean, we are capable of so much, and we forget that because we're familiar with our bodies, right? And so we kind of go to sleep after a while, and we forget how powerful we really are.
Well, that's an interesting point that you raised there about being capable of so much, because when you look at some of the things that can happen, and some of the trauma. I mean, you take any war, for example, and look at, sometimes how mutilated a body gets, and it recovers.
Yeah.
It's quite amazing what we can deal with. And then you also look at some people that go through traumatic experience. I mean, look at Helen Keller, and what she was able to accomplish. I mean, we're able to, like you say, we're able to accomplish so much. But is it a case, from that perspective, like, do we need to just keep reminding ourselves that, hey, you've got this capability. You're capable of so much.
Yes, and that's why I think it's important to read stories of history, adventure stories of people who have done outrageous things. For example, I read the Shackleton story, and I don't know if you're familiar with this.
No.
Shackleton was a maritime explorer who went to travel in Antarctica. He was an
Mm,
early explorer in Antarctica and had just one catastrophe after another. And the crew, they were basically exposed to Antarctic winters. And this went on for a couple of years before they finally reached civilization. And
mm.
it's an extraordinary story, but there's so many of these. And that would make a great curriculum for young men to just, as reminders, you've got this. Your body can do amazing things.
Wow, that's awesome. I'm a little bit blown away by that. I was thinking
Yeah,
about that. I'm
yeah,
gonna have
yeah.
to look up those stories.
Mhm.
Um, do you think that's where we're at? Because we're starting to run out of time as well. If you was to sum up where we're at, is it you've got this, you're capable of so much? Where would you sum up this framework for being manly? If you were to summarize it, how would you do it?
Well, it's all about how you show up. And then, we talked about John Wooden and his athletic coaching philosophy, and how a lot of senseis and teachers and coaches share this. But I think being manly is how you show up in the world. And when I teach this, I tell people that, you show up with as much as you've got. And this means radical sincerity. This means showing up with your trauma, your woundedness, whatever it is. You may not be fully integrated, but you bring as much as you can possibly bring to every encounter. And it may not be as much as you'd like, and it's definitely not going to be perfect, but you show up with your whole thing. And an athletic coach would say you show up with your game face on.
Mm,
And the sensei would say the same thing.
mm.
And I think that's a good place to begin. It's all about how you show up.
I love that. Show up with whatever. Yeah, all about how you show up. Show up with as much as
Yeah,
you've got. I love that.
as integrated as you can be, as whole and complete as you can be. No matter,
Mm,
you may not be feeling good that day. You may be traumatized as a child. You may be injured or wounded or diseased or whatever it is. You show up with all of it, and
yeah,
it
I love, and
works.
that's
Uh,
okay. I love that. Yeah, that
Yeah,
even on a bad day, you might be having a shitty time, and you show up with that. You just that's what you've got on that day.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Instead of escaping, I mean, there's a million ways to escape, but no, that's the manly thing to do, is to show up.
Yeah, I love that. Frank, this has been such an awesome conversation. I'd love to chat further and again in the future if you've got time, but thank you for taking the time to be on the show.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very much a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. So, yeah, let's be in touch.
Thank you for being part of the Share.care community and helping people around the world prosper. You're creating a bigger pie for everyone to share. The more people contributing to the world being a better place, the better the world becomes for others and for you.